today's video does come with a fairly serious content warning. Two stories actually do have content warnings at the beginning of them, so if you want to skip those, timestamps are all down below in the description and should be in the pinned comment, assuming I do things as I normally do. And if you have a story you want to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. When I was a kid, probably around 6 years old, I had a summer experience that still sends shivers down my spine. It was one of those events that happened quickly and could have been much worse, but it taught me one hell of a lesson by the end of it. I remember that it was a really hot day, the kind where the air does that fun shimmering stuff off the asphalt, and I was home with my mom. She was a teacher at my school, and we were both on break. We were spending some time in the backyard. My mom was inflating and then filling the little pool that my dad had bought the weekend before, and I was just excitedly running around waiting to jump in the water. My mom told me to go inside and get us a couple of popsicles, and I excitedly did what she requested. I was there digging in the freezer for a specific flavor, blue raspberry of course, and enjoying the cold air blasting me in the face, when I heard it. A light knock at the door. We didn't really get a lot of visitors where we lived, usually just my grandparents or our neighbor Miss Shelley, whom I absolutely adored. Thinking it was probably Grandma or Miss Shelley, I went over and swung the door open, expecting to be greeted by a warm smile and some cookies. Instead, there was a man standing there, a stranger, with a creepy yellow grin that seemed to be way too big for his face. I may have been 6 years old, but I cannot forget that face. The smell hit me next, a sour stench that made my nose scrunch up. I didn't know it then, but as an adult, I now realize that it was probably the stink of some kind of booze. I bluntly asked this guy who he was, and he laughed and responded that he was a friend, and that he was there to see me. I was a pretty social kid, so I just assumed that he was a friend of my parents that I hadn't met yet. When I asked him how he knew me, he leaned down, laughed, and said, "I've known you for a long time. I was there when you were born." It was a weird thing to say, but at that age, I didn't really question it. He then followed this up with, "Hey, why don't you come outside? I brought lunch for us. You like pizza, right?" I did, in fact, like pizza. In fact, I loved pizza. And with the word pizza mentioned, I then really wanted pizza. I started to step outside, but just as I did, my mom appeared at the front door and put a hand on my shoulder. She asked this man who he was and what he wanted. I remember him flashing that ugly yellow smile at her and asking for someone named Melissa. My mom, clearly not convinced, told him, "No one named Melissa lives here. I think you need to leave." He then responded with an, "Oh, of course, my mistake," still holding that creepy smile, and turned to walk off. Without saying another word, he walked out our front gate, got into an old minivan, and drove off. My mom immediately pulled me back into the house, and that's when I got my first lesson about stranger danger. She explained that we should never trust people that we don't know like that, especially if they're asking us to go somewhere with them. I mentioned that he said he was a friend and that he was there when I was born. She told me that none of that was true, and that sometimes people will lie to get us to trust them. Now, looking back as an adult, I realize how close I came to a potentially dangerous situation. If my mom hadn't come inside to check on me when she did, well, I really don't like to think about what could have happened. It's a really chilling reminder of how important it is to teach kids about the dangers of trusting strangers. And it's a lesson that I've held closely ever since. I used this story to actually explain to my own son about stranger danger. I never saw that guy again, thankfully, and I hope that I never do. I was 15 years old. I was coming home from a party with a couple of friends around midnight. We'd been out drinking and having a good time, and the party was pretty far away, so we were taking the bus home. The two friends that I was busing home with were going to have a sleepover at one of their houses, but I was tired and felt like sleeping in my own bed for that night. My friend tried to convince me to come with them because it was late, and they didn't want me getting home alone. I assured them that it would be fine. We were the only ones on the bus at this time. However, about 5 minutes before we got off, a man got on. He appeared to be in his early 20s, and I could have sworn that I'd seen him before. Not from social functions or anything, but just from around the neighborhood. When he got on the bus, he sat fairly close to us, especially considering we were the only ones on the bus, and that there were other seats that he could have chosen. I noticed that he kept looking at us, and it seemed like he was closely listening in on our conversations, but I didn't think much of it, especially since he seemed close to our age. About 5 minutes later, it was my stop to get off. My friends stayed on the bus because they had a couple more stops to go. Oddly, the man on the bus got off at my stop too, despite only having just gotten on the bus. To be completely honest, I didn't really think anything of it at the time. If anything, I actually felt safer that someone was walking in the same direction as me, as it was dark and late. My house was about a 15-minute walk from that bus stop. The walk home was through a dark path through a park and then through what I considered to be a sketchy neighborhood. The guy was walking behind me, not too closely, but also not far away. At this point, I didn't feel uneasy at all. I was thinking about the night that I'd had with my friends and the best way to sneak into my house while my parents were asleep. About 5 minutes had passed, and he was still behind me. I wanted to let him pass because I don't really like people walking behind me in general, so I started walking a lot slower. But the distance between us didn't change. After that, I started walking faster, and the distance between us was still the same. Close, but not too close. I found it very odd how consistent the distance between us was, and how attentive he seemed. He wasn't listening to music, or distracted by his phone. At this point, I started to feel nervous, and I felt like I was being followed. By now, there were a lot of paths that he could have turned down, but he was still walking the same route as me. I thought of an idea to test this theory. This way I would know for sure if he was following me, and honestly, I was kind of scared to find out. The path we were walking on was about to diverge into two paths going in separate directions. The way home was on the left, but I started walking down the right path first. He followed on the right path as well. Then, at the last second, I cut over through the grass to the left path. And I swear, when I turned around and saw that he also cut over to the left path in that instance, I have never been more terrified in my entire life. I turned around and faced him, and I started screaming at him that I was calling the cops. By his reaction, it appeared that I really caught him off guard. He quickly walked away, and I've never seen him again since. I'm 24 now, but I still remember this like it happened yesterday. I still think about what could have happened that night. I have a story that I've been wanting to share with the world for a while. A story that really taught me a lesson about trusting people and made me realize how things can go really bad, really fast. I am going to add a bit of a trigger warning here, as this story does end in a horrifying way. This happened a while back, when my high school ex-boyfriend, a guy we're going to call Christian, came back into my life after close to a decade of being out of touch. Back in high school, Christian and I were really close. He was probably the most connected relationship I've ever had, if that makes any sense. He was actually the first guy that I got with, in multiple meanings of the word, and I thought that he and I had this really bright future planned out. In my head, we were going to get married, we were going to have kids, and we were going to grow old together. In reality, Christian didn't want anything more than a high school fling, and he planned on cutting away from me the minute that he graduated. He ended up telling me as much only a quarter away from graduation. We were talking about the future, and when I asked if we were going to stay in state, he said that after May, there was no we. Needless to say, we broke up that day, and it crushed me. Fast forward around 8 or 9 years later, I'm single, living my best life, and just doing whatever life brings. When, out of the blue, I get a friend request on Facebook from a face that I hadn't thought about in ages. Christian. Being the nostalgic idiot that I am, I immediately went to accept it, but then hesitated when I thought about how our relationship ended. I sat on it for a couple of hours, but eventually decided that we were both young, we both made mistakes, and it wasn't anything more than a friend request on Facebook. If he had grown up enough to seek me out and to reconnect, then I could grow up enough to accept it. What I didn't expect was that clicking that button was going to be the opening of my own personal Pandora's box. At first, everything was chill. We messaged back and forth, and it seemed like he really had his life together. After high school, he went out of state for college, and he'd actually gotten married and had a son. I congratulated him for all that, saying that it was great to hear that he was doing well, and then he told me that he and his wife had gotten a divorce, and she had done everything she could to keep his son from him. So, he was actually moving back in with his mom for a bit to get back on his feet. I apologized, and I told him that that was awful. And after a bit of talking more, he told me that he was actually in town, and we agreed to meet up for lunch the next day, just to catch up. Now, nowhere in this conversation and nowhere in my mind was there any intention of making this anything beyond just being friends. I didn't want anything beyond that. I just wanted a friend, and I just wanted to meet up to catch up with him. When we met at the restaurant, I went in for a friendly hug, and when he hugged me, his hand wandered way too far down my back. I immediately pushed away and looked at him like, "Bro, what the hell?" He quickly apologized and said that he just got absorbed in the moment, and he didn't mean anything by it. I told him that this was his one warning, and that if he tried anything else, this meeting was over, which I think caught him off guard. I think he expected me to be a bit more submissive, mostly because when I was young, I was way more willing to go along with things. In the years since then, I've become a lot more self-sufficient and mentally sound, and I'm not the kind of person to take that crap. I told him as much, and he nodded, saying all right and continuing to apologize. The rest of the lunch went pretty normal. Nothing else happened, and I figured that he knew his place. Of course, that was the wrong thing to believe. About 2 days later, I got a message from Christian on Facebook that said, "Thinking of you," with a picture of something that I genuinely did not expect nor want to see. The situation was very disappointing for multiple reasons, and I told him that that was the end of it. I replied, saying, "I told you that if you did anything like this again, that would be the end of it." He immediately said, "Oh my god, I am so sorry, that was for someone else, I swear." I messaged back saying that it was nice to see that he was doing well, but that was the end of our conversations, and immediately blocked him. I'm not stupid. I knew what he was doing, and I wasn't going to be this rebound fling for him. Plus, he's not exactly the kind of person that I'm into anymore. After that, the situation with Christian went off the rails, and did so pretty quickly. One night, about 2 weeks later, I was out with some friends at a local bar just trying to have a good time, and lo and behold, Christian showed up. He walked in and came straight over to us, acting like he was my best friend. The entire feel of the night changed immediately. My 3 friends all glanced over at me like, who's this guy? And Christian stood over me and smiled like everything was fine. I hit my limit the second he put his hands on my shoulders and said, "How you doing, babe?" I shoved my seat backwards to make sure that it made contact with him, stood up, turned around, and told him that I wasn't his babe, and that he needed to leave me the hell alone. He laughed and asked why I was being like this, and I went off on him. I told him that I had given him a chance to be my friend and nothing more, and he decided that he wanted to be a creep instead. I told him again to shove off and to get the hell back out of my life. After a few moments, he backed off and looked like he was about to cry, and just walked away. I kind of assumed that was going to be the end of it, that he would understand, that I wanted nothing to do with him. Either that, or the next encounter was going to end violently. Unfortunately for me, knowing him, it was more likely to be the latter. After Christian left, the whole night was ruined, and we all decided to head home. I had driven my friend Michelle out that night, and she'd planned on drinking a bit more, and I don't drink, so I was her driver. When we left, she asked me who Christian was, and when I explained everything to her, she told me that he sounded like a creep, and then asked me if I wanted her to come over to my place and stay just in case. At first, I didn't think it was necessary, but after a bit of contemplation, I told her that it sounded like a good idea and that I would appreciate the company. I'm going to add a bit of a brief pause right here for the sake of anyone reading or listening to this. The next part of the story is the part that deserves the content warning. When we got to my apartment, I unlocked and opened the door, and both myself and Michelle were surprised to see Christian sitting on my couch. Now, I know that a lot of these stories end with the ex standing there with a knife and attacking the person, but that's not actually how my story ended. Christian was sitting on my couch. He did have a knife, but he wasn't going to attack anybody. He pretty clearly ended his own life right there. I was shocked, horrified. I felt like I was about to throw up. Right there on my couch was my high school ex, a guy that I had just sort of reconnected with, and had to push back out of my life because he was being a creep, and he had ended his own life in my apartment. I cannot overstate how traumatizing this was for me at that moment, and every day since. Obviously, we called the police, and when they and the medics showed up, they confirmed that he was beyond saving. I couldn't stay there after that. They had to treat it basically as a crime scene with what had happened, and I didn't want to stay there anyways. This was enough to get me out of my lease, thankfully, and I ended up moving in with Michelle in her apartment. I got rid of pretty much all of my furniture, as I couldn't bring myself to look at it and think about Christian. I've had nightmares about him since, about that moment. Opening my door and to say that this whole thing has haunted me is an understatement. I'm not looking for pity, and I feel terrible for the fact that Christian felt that ending his own life was the best course of action. I'm just not really sure what else to say about all of it. Through all of this, coming to terms with the situation, and moving my few things out that I did keep, I ended up finding a note from Christian in my bedroom. He'd actually placed it in the drawer of my nightstand. It was a simple note that just said, "Every mistake in my life has led me to this moment, and all that I can say is that I'm sorry." Not exactly closure, and not exactly something that helped me move on from it. And to be honest, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to get through it. A few years ago, I used to live in an apartment complex that was attached to a really nice public park. One that was surrounded entirely with a walking path that broke away on one part to go into a wooded area. I've walked this park hundreds of times, like literally hundreds of times. I used to walk that park every single day after work for a couple of years. It was one of the safest places that I'd ever walked, and honestly, I never expected anything to happen to me while I walked it. But the day that this happened, my illusion of how safe it was definitely shattered. I was about halfway through my usual route, which included about half of the branch path that took me out into the forest. I didn't like to do the whole thing because it went too far out for me. But I would go until I reached the benches, which would be the halfway mark, and then turn around and head home. I was minding my own business when I started to get this weird feeling, like something was watching or following me. You know that creepy, crawly sensation that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up? I tried to shake it off, thinking that I was just a bit anxious, or that maybe there was a person there, but they were just walking. After a few more minutes, I started to feel a bit worse, and was thinking that I was just being paranoid, until I turned around and saw that there was a guy that was standing on the side of the path, looking around like he lost something. But then, every few moments, he would glance up in my direction. He was a bit overweight, wearing a white and green tracksuit. I slowed down as I walked and half turned to look at the guy to make sure that he knew that I saw him. As soon as I did, this guy stopped looking at the ground and stood straight up, gave a small wave, and said, "Oh, hey." I didn't reply. I just stood where I was and gave a small wave back. As soon as I did, he nodded and laughed and then started stepping toward me at an escalated pace. My instincts kicked in, and I took off down the path, starting at a medium run, but when I looked back and saw that this guy was now chasing me as fast as he could, I took off into a full sprint. For a few moments, this guy was running at me, and I was running away. Thankfully, I was definitely faster than he was, as I was able to get back to the part of the path that branched off. I ducked down into some of the thicker bushes, hiding and seeing if this guy was going to follow me this far. After a couple more seconds, he actually did run down to the split, and he slowed down to a walk as he caught his breath and looked around. I just sat there, ducked down into these bushes, feeling my heart pound so hard that I might throw up, watching this guy look around the paths. Then, I heard something that completely confirmed my fear. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, pressed a button on the screen, and started talking. I couldn't make out the full conversation, but I heard enough to know that this situation was as terrifying as I thought. "Hey, yeah, I lost her." His voice was frustrated and angry, and I knew for a fact that had I not gotten away from this guy, bad things would have happened. After a few more words, he hung up and yelled a few expletives out into the woods, and then slowly walked back the way that he came. I stayed hidden in those bushes for a while, until it clicked in my mind that I should probably call 911. I pulled out my phone and dialed it and explained to them that there was a guy on the walking path that had been chasing me, and explained what he had said on the phone. The woman said that they would send some police out to the park and to meet them there if possible. I got out of the hiding spot, and when I was certain that he was in fact gone, I walked back toward my building. I waited in the parking lot of the property for a while, and in an incredibly disappointing twist, the police never showed up. My guess, they probably got a call that was more important than "weird man followed me in the park." But I would have at least liked a call back or something. But of course, it didn't happen. The whole thing really messed me up, and I never walked back to that park. I ended up taking my walks around the parking lot of the apartment complex because I couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods, just in case. It's scary to think about what might have happened had he gotten a hold of me, but thankfully that didn't happen. I have no idea what happened, and honestly, I hope that no one ever ended up in that situation that I did. And I hope that I never run into him ever again. And to everyone else, be careful and stay aware because you never know who might be watching. The story does come with a content warning as it does involve sexual assault. If you do not want to listen to a story that contains that, go down to the timestamps below and skip to the next story. I will give a few moments of silence here just so anyone who wants to do so can. I've been a long-time lurker on a number of true scary story groups and platforms, and after reading all the horrifying things that everyone else went through, I thought I should go ahead and share what happened to me my senior year of high school. Well, I guess it didn't happen to me. It happened to my friend, whom we're going to call Lily for the sake of privacy. But it was a terrible situation, and I was definitely a part of it. It also involved an instructor at our high school, who we're just going to refer to as Mr. Smith. To set the stage a bit, Mr. Smith was a new teacher at our school. Our senior year was his first year teaching at our school, and he wasn't the youngest teacher. He looked to be in his mid to late 30s, but he was charismatic and quickly became popular because he seemed to relate to us kids. He was one of those teachers that was in the know about pop culture and things that the students liked, and a lot of us students really adored him and his class. He was an English teacher, and he actually made the class engaging and entertaining. My friend Lily and I were in the same hour with Mr. Smith, and from the beginning I couldn't help but notice that Mr. Smith did seem to pay her an unusual amount of attention. At first I thought it was just him trying to help her out a bit extra in class, making sure that she was understanding things and not struggling, which I've seen before. However, there was one day that completely solidified all of the suspicions that I'd had, and made me see that the attention that Mr. Smith was giving to Lily was not innocent or professional. One day, at the end of the school day, I realized that I had accidentally forgotten to turn in an assignment for Mr. Smith's class, and I made a beeline for the room so that I could get it turned in. When I opened the door, I saw Mr. Smith and Lily in the room, and while they weren't doing anything obvious, the feeling of the room was definitely inappropriate. They were both clothed, obviously, but it was pretty clear to me that something was going on or being talked about that shouldn't be talked about in a classroom setting. I timidly entered the room and handed my assignment to Mr. Smith, and as I did, he thanked me and said something like, "Anyways, Lily, if you need more help, we can set aside a time here in the near future to figure things out." She said okay, and she actually walked out of the room with me. Obviously, I asked her what that was all about, and she just shrugged it off, saying that he was helping her with homework. That was obviously a lie, but I also didn't want to just jump to conclusions. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe nothing had happened and I was just looking at it wrong. Yeah, those justifications were completely wiped from my mind as the next few days went on. After having walked in on whatever that was, I started noticing everything that pushed me into believing that it wasn't innocent. I noticed how close he would get to her, how much extra attention and extra help he would give her in class, which would require him to be, right against her. How he would randomly say things like, "Oh, you look nice today, Lily." Things that would sound guiltless, just small compliments and the like, but these virtuous compliments to me were anything but. Then, it came to a head. About a month after I walked in on their situation, Lily came to me in tears after school. I was at my locker getting my stuff together, and she tapped me on the shoulder. When I turned around, she was a mess. Her makeup was running, and she looked absolutely miserable. She asked me if I could give her a ride home, which was surprising to me. We'd always been friends, sure, but we weren't that close. I told her that I could, and we made our way out to my car. The way that she changed from in tears to sobbing uncontrollably the second the doors closed was horrible. She exploded into telling me about what was going on between herself and Mr. Smith. Basically what I anticipated. She said that it wasn't anything serious, that he'd flirted with her and she had reciprocated, but they hadn't gone any further than that. Until that day. That day, she had gone to his room to ask about an assignment, to actually ask about schoolwork, and without going too far into the disturbing details, he pushed himself onto her, and he had definitely gotten handsy. She said that she tried to push him away, but struggled with him, and he said something like, "You know you want this as much as I do." She said that she reached up, slapped him, and that's when he finally let her go. She then ran away from the room and found me. Of course, my first thought was that we needed to report him. She agreed initially, but then mentioned that she didn't think anyone would believe her. She said there was no one else in the room. There were obviously no cameras in the classroom, and she was worried that she would be labeled a liar, or that people would claim that she was just trying to ruin him. We spoke about it a bit, and the conversation ended with her asking me to let her consider things for a couple of days before we did. For those few days, I genuinely tried to respect her wishes. But seeing how he was still making comments towards Lily, and how he was still trying to get close to her during class, even when she was no longer showing interest in him, my conscience wouldn't let me stay silent. I couldn't help but shake this thought that he would go further and assault her again if they met in private, because it sounded like he was more than willing to escalate. So, I made a very difficult decision, and I went to the administrators and reported Mr. Smith. I told them everything that Lily had told me, and I told them about when I walked in on them meeting. The administrator that I talked to took my statements very seriously. She asked me how certain I was of these allegations, stating that it was a very serious situation. I told her that I knew how serious it was. I told her that Lily had asked me to wait because she was scared that no one would believe her, but that I felt like I needed to tell them. The investigation was actually a lot quicker than I expected. It turns out that Lily wasn't the only girl that Mr. Smith had targeted. During their short investigation, after talking with a few other students, there were actually 3 other girls that were willing to tell them about comments that Mr. Smith had made. One of them even told them that he tried to go further with them a few months prior. As the evidence mounted, the school actually got the police involved, and one day, after school, Mr. Smith was arrested for what he had done, and was eventually charged with multiple counts of sexual misconduct with a minor. The whole school was definitely in shock as the news got around, and a lot of people felt really betrayed by this guy. My friendship with Lily, however, was pretty much over. She was angry that I had gone behind her back and felt like I had taken away her control over the situation. I tried to explain that I did it to protect her and others, but she couldn't see it that way. We drifted apart, and by the time we graduated, we were no longer friends. It's been a few years since then, and I still think about Lily often. I wonder if I made the right choice, if I could have handled it differently, or if there was something more that I could have done to help her. But ultimately, I have to believe that getting a predator like Mr. Smith out of our school was worth the cost. I was 21 and in college in a relatively small town in western Colorado. I lived in an apartment building on campus, and our doors opened up to the outside. I was out smoking a cigarette, and it was around 10 p.m. I had class the next day, pretty early, so I was planning on going to bed right after I was done. Even though the town was small, there was a significant homeless population. There were a few shelters that would put up homeless people in hotels for a few nights, but they would have to go and request one during the shelter's normal business hours. As I was sitting there, planning out my next day, a disheveled homeless man walked up to me. He appeared to be in his mid-30s. He asked if he could bum a smoke, so I obliged. Normally, the homeless population would stay off campus because there were no shelters around the college. I have no idea why this man was there. I expected him to just walk away after obtaining his cigarette, but instead he sat down and started talking to me. Being the nice person that I am, I asked him about why he was there. He told me that he was just trying to find a warm place to sleep for the night, since it was late fall and the weather was turning cold. I told him that there were a few shelters about 2 miles from where we were. He told me that they wouldn't let him stay because he'd been drinking that night. I then offered to get him some Gatorade from my room because he told me that he was really thirsty. I grabbed the Gatorade and he asked if I had any food. I told him no because I got all my food from the cafeteria, and he then begged me to let him stay on my couch for the night. I told him that I wished I could, but my roommates wouldn't appreciate waking up to a random person in our apartment, and also it was against the apartment rules. What I did next was, admittedly, very stupid. I offered to walk him to the student center, about a 5-minute walk from my apartment, and see what they could do for him. When we got there, I asked the desk attendant if they could help him in any way. They told me no because he wasn't a student. At this point, I was getting some weird vibes from this guy. I tried to tell him that I needed to get back to my place because I had class early the next morning, and he insisted that I needed to help him find a warm place to sleep for the night. Me, trying to be as nice as I could, proceeded to walk him all across campus, trying to find a good place for him to sleep for the night. He had a small sleeping bag. I told him the parking garage might be a good bet, but he said he had done that before and security had banned him from campus. At this point, alarm bells were going off in my head. I couldn't just leave him, though, because I was in too deep. We walked together to the soccer field nearby to see if any of the bathrooms were open for him to sleep in. They were all locked, so we tried the baseball field directly across the street. It had been around an hour since I met this stranger, and I needed to get out of this dangerous situation. There were no other people around since it was getting pretty late, and he begged me again to stay on my couch, and again, I refused. What I did next wasn't my proudest moments, by any means. I told him to try the bathrooms around the back of the baseball field, even though I had no idea if any were actually back there. As he turned to go check, I ran as fast as I could out of there and kept running for 10 minutes back to my apartment. I got in, and I looked out the window for a long time since the room was right next to the door. The man did know where I lived since I'd met him right in front of my building, but I saw absolutely no sign of him. The moral of the story: no matter how nice of a person you are, please don't try to help random homeless people that you meet late at night. So that, my friends, was today's collection of stalker and stranger stories. Stories about stalkers, strangers, creeps, weirdos, and people who come into your life and make things hectic, terrifying, if you will. This video did contain some very serious stories, which they're all serious, obviously, the edutainment part of this, but I don't normally do stories that are that serious, if that makes sense. But just as everyone else's experiences are valid and important to be heard, those are important stories to hear. So, yeah. Enjoyed may be a strong word, but hopefully you guys enjoyed the video and the stories. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, again, liked may be a strong word, but consider subscribing if you want more. You can also do things such as joining Patreon and memberships down below, where you get early access and extra stuff like that. There's also the comment section. And that's one of my favorite sections on my videos, because I get to interact with you beautiful people. So, if you have something to say to me, go down to the comment section and leave me a comment. It's likely that I will respond. It's not guaranteed, but I do my best. So, all that said, friends, I hope you're all having a gorgeous day. I hope that I do see you again very soon. But until then, please remember you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you're the best you that you can be. Never let anyone tell you otherwise, and please never forget it. And until next time, much love, and sleep well.